Today's show is sponsored by ExpressVPN. My savvy fans secure their internet. Join them at expressvpn.com/yang. You're the CEO of one of the biggest poverty fighting organizations in the world, Robinhood, which handles like bajillions of dollars. And even you're looking at it being like, this is not enough.
You cannot come up with $1 million solutions to $1 trillion problems.
Yes. Hallelujah.
I don't call what we do charity. I think charity is paternalistic and it's offensive, right? I think we're not a charity, we're a change organization. You know, we believe in changing the fundamental structures of a society in which we exist in. The things that we've invested in that I'm most proud of are the things we no longer invest in.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? The things we don't have to invest in anymore. It's either the problem was solved or government took it over. We were the first organization that invested in needle exchanges. And we did it at a time when it was really controversial and really scary, and people saying, what do you mean, giving drug dealers clean needles? Well, the data was showing that if you're looking at the rise of HIV AIDS, it was actually the transmission of dirty needles. That was one of the fastest rates for this transmission. And so we piloted it and we funded it. And now we don't fund it anymore because the federal government does it. But they were never going to be first money in.
All right, guys. On today's episode of Yang Speaks, the conversation you are waiting for. Andrew's thoughts on Kamala Harris as the vice president pick of the Democratic Party. But more importantly, we talk about hashtag Let Yang Speak DNC. You're not going to want to miss this episode. And then, of course, we wrap it up with a fascinating conversation with Wes Moore, who's the CEO of Robinhood and an author and this complete, incredible human being. So stay tuned. It's going to be a good one. Back in Yang Speaks for a special episode because we've had breaking news, Andrew. A lot has happened since our last episode.
Yes. Kamala Harris, vice president, Biden-Harris ticket. I'm excited. No, I got to know Kamala very well on the trail. It's funny, like the different candidates, you're literally side by side. In the case of me and Kamala, I think I was at her debate neighbor multiple times.
Yeah.
One time I smuggled a handkerchief on stage for her. She was just like, "Hey, can you take this on for me?" I was like, "Sure." But more than that, we were in Iowa back to back multiple times. Really much more Iowa than anything else because she spent a lot of time there, and I did too. But we have each other's contact info. I got to know her husband too on the trail, Doug, who's a great guy. I'm excited. I think the Biden-Harris ticket is really hard to beat. It's like it feels balanced. And Kamala's a freaking powerhouse. She's a
force in nature, yeah.
Yeah, like she will be very, very strong on the trail and make a lot of people very excited. So it's great. And the most important thing always to me was Joe's desire for the right partner, because he wanted someone he had the right relationship with. And it seems like he had a relationship with Kamala from way back because she was friends with his son, Beau, when he was attorney general, and she was an attorney general. So, yeah, it's a phenomenal pick.
In terms of your relationships with candidates on the trail, you were closest, I thought, with Joe and Kamala and maybe Tulsi.
Forgot about Cory Booker, my guy.
Cory, sorry. You're right. Selfishly, from Andrew Yang perspective, this is pretty cool because you're friendly with her or friends with her. But thoughts on the strategy of this? Like, what do you think, besides do I like the person? Do I think they're a good leader? What do you think from a political standpoint, optics standpoint? What are your thoughts on the Kamala pick?
Well, I think there's a really great balance, again, where you have Joe, who's older, and then you have Kamala, who's like a generation younger. You have obviously the gender dynamic, the race dynamic. It's very balanced. There's even a little bit of an East Coast, West Coast thing going.
The right, I watched Fox News last night because I'm always interested in what they say about the VP pick, and they already have tried to brand her. And Ben Shapiro came out, same thing, said Kamala is a radical lefty. And to me, that branding does not stick. I think
No, it
she's
really doesn't.
as moderate as they come. I think it's insane to try and call her that. I think, yes, she's had some California policies she's kind of been wrapped up in, or just by being a senator from the San Francisco or Bay Area is one thing. But she was an attorney general. She's a very moderate, sensible politician. So I think that won't stick. I don't know. To me, she's already been branded, and throwing the nonsense at her won't stick the way it might with some of the other lesser-known VP candidates he was considering.
Yeah, I think they have to try that. I don't think it's correct or effective, but
Right.
At this point, they're in desperation mode.
Yeah, it was fascinating. Like Hannity and Laura Ingraham were like, "This is the most radical ticket the Democrats have ever run," and you're like, "Really?
Not really. I don't think that's correct.
I don't know. I don't know how many moderates are really watching Fox News anymore, but I don't know. But that doesn't feel right. So, congrats to Kamala and her team. And I'm excited. I think this is a solid pick. And look, the other piece of this is that all of the Democrats fell in line, which I think is rare. Like, we usually have rifts in our party, and it was nice to see the rest of the Democratic leadership and candidates all come out and support her and Joe with the pick.
Yeah, I agree. Congrats to Kamala and Doug and the whole team. Let's win this thing.
Yeah. So we're going to help, which is exciting, which brings me to other forms of helping, and probably one of the reasons many of you tuned in, because yesterday, #LetYangSpeakDNC was trending. I think it got up to number 3 in politics on Twitter, but it was like it's top 10 in Twitter, at least in the United States. So the high-level overview is that the DNC came out with their, let's call it their speaker card, of who's speaking all 4 days during the DNC convention. And we were left off that list, which was a bit of a shock to us because we've been in conversations with the DNC about speaking and have been given what seems to be some primetime slots throughout the week. We are, expected to speak at the convention, be a member. So, and then you tweeted out, if I'm honest, I was expecting to speak in a sense of speak with the people on that list. So I think the world is interested in your real reaction and also why this matters to you and to, frankly, our supporters.
I think I commented to a journalist that it's not like you or me were jumping up and down, like yelling in anyone's ear, being like, "Oh, we need this spot, we need that spot." But there is like a real sense that we have a lot of people that supported my campaign, many of whom were on the fence about Joe,
Right.
and I've been telling them we need to get behind Joe and get Trump out. And I said this makes that case a little bit harder to make because one reason why people who supported me would support Joe is like, okay, if Yang is a big part of the team, then we can advance some of the ideas and policies that I ran on. It's just a harder case to make if it seems like we are not being included. And to your point, it's like I thought we were being included.
Yeah.
That was like the mystery. It's like, what transpires here?
I want to be clear to people listening. It's not about us. Would you like to speak? Sure, but that's not the point of this. The point is we have a powerful message and a lot of people that supported it and wanted this voice heard.
And it was actually really touching, the outpouring of support. So thank you if you were part of it. But like the outpouring of support yesterday, I was like, wow, like that's so.
That was hilarious. People that have
heartwarming.
hated on you forever. People have hated on you forever on MSNBC. They'll remain nameless, but they came out and they were like, Andrew Yang's beyond there. This is ridiculous. Like that to me was, I don't know, funny and kind of case in point.
Touching, invigorating. Like, it was gratifying. I was like, oh, thank you. That's so kind. Really, because like I did reflect on it for a minute because. There are other folks that are also not on the program that ran, and the fact that there doesn't seem to be much of an outcry, it was really touching to me. I was like, oh, wow, like people recognize what we did.
Yeah.
So thank you to everyone who helped make that happen. We're keeping making things happening every day.
Twitter went nuts. Here we are. We'll be involved in the convention somehow. All right. So today's episode, you've got Wes Moore, man, and listening to this conversation, Andrew, my jaw dropped like 6 times. Like, what a powerful story and what a powerful guy. You guys hit it off and been friends before, right? You knew him prior to running, right?
Wes and I have been friends for years. Wes is like a real life superhero where he's like an Army Ranger and author and entrepreneur and Oprah's friend and author, has a great new book about 5 days in Baltimore. And he's one of the leading anti-poverty activists in the country, where he's the CEO of Robinhood, which distributes tens, hundreds of millions of dollars to fight poverty in the New York area, and is one of like the biggest anti-poverty labs that there is. So thrilled to be able to sit down with Wes, and we talk a little bit about how I sat down with him when I started the campaign, because I was like, hey, if anyone's going to be into abolishing poverty, it's going to be Wes Moore. And so, but I hadn't had a chance to catch up with him in months. So enjoyed the heck out of this conversation. Author, entrepreneur, patriot, anti-poverty leader, Wes Moore on Yang Speaks. Here at Yang Speaks, we think that our data is ours. We should be sharing in its value. We should have control over it. And certainly we should know if Big Brother is peering over our shoulder. Now, in today's day and age, that's easier said than done. But one way you can make sure that your data stays safe and secure is by using a VPN. And here at Yang Speaks, we recommend ExpressVPN. It's #1 rated by Wired and others. It's like using the internet someplace else magically by hitting a button. And you can use it to feel like you're a secret agent. You can use it to access content that's only available in Europe. What the hell are they watching in Europe? Well, you can find out. So just use ExpressVPN, and my link is expressvpn.com/yang. You can get an extra 3 months of ExpressVPN for free at expressvpn.com/yang. It is my honor and pleasure to welcome to Yang Speaks my good friend, the decorated veteran, author, combater of poverty, all-around superhero, former Rhodes Scholar. I guess you're always a Rhodes Scholar. That's the way that shit works. Wes Moore. Wes, welcome to Yang Speaks.
Andrew, it's good to see you, man. It's good to be hanging out here with the Yang Gang, man. I'm thankful for this. I've been looking forward to this for a long time, man. I'm proud of you.
Well, you and me both, and we have so much to talk about.
Yeah.
I saw you when I was just starting to run for president, when it was a little bit more crazy, shall we say.
And you know what's funny? I tell people all the time, I will never forget that meeting where you came up to the office of Robinhood. We're talking about poverty. We're talking about work. And so then I asked you a question. I'm like, so what are you up to? And you said, I think I'm going to run for president. And I remember taking that pause, like, wait, is he serious right now, or is he saying something that's supposed to react? And then when I realized you were serious, I remember getting up and giving you a hug, because I was like, this is so. I mean, it's so unbelievably bold and brave and beautiful. And when you think about it in respects of where we are as a nation and what we need, we've got to be thinking bold. We got to be thinking brave on this stuff, because it's I think that's kind of what the moment it's what the moment requires and asks for. So I will never forget exactly where we were in my office and where we were sitting when you first told me that you were running for president.
Yeah, and that was one of the best reactions I got. Thank you, Wes. I remember it too. And I mean, your perspective on so much of this, and we're going to talk about your new book, 5 Days, because it's very timely and of the moment. But I feel like your perspective is exactly what we need, where you grew up, rough background, saw your father pass, I believe, at a young age, shifted around, moved around, had trouble in school. Were sent to military school for a while, which was a code I thought for, like, this kid can't stop getting into trouble. like that code. And then you went to a junior college, and then transferred to Hopkins, wound up a Rhodes Scholar. And then this is what the turn I love so much, is that you wound up working in finance, but then you self-ejected out of there and became an Army Ranger, a paratrooper, where you then became a decorated combat veteran, instead of doing what, frankly, like 99% of people in that circumstance do, which is just try and stay near the money tree and have some of like the, the fruit of the money tree drop on your head, and then convince yourself that it was all because of how awesome you were. So then you went, after coming back from the military, wrote multiple best-selling books, including the other Wes Moore that I think they use in schools around the country. Became a host on Oprah. And then when you and I were in your office, you're the CEO of one of the biggest poverty-fighting organizations in the world, Robin Hood, which handles like bajillions of dollars. Like how much do you guys give away in like a given year?
Yeah, I mean, a given year we'll do anywhere from 150 to 200. In its existence, Robinhood has given away north of $3 billion to the poverty fight.
Yeah, when you hear 150, like you might be thinking 1,000. He's talking about million. Like that. Like this organization gives away hundreds of millions of dollars on the regular to organizations in New York City. That's like the domain. And so when you and I were talking, so to me, your perspective is similar to mine in that you sort of headed all the way up into the belly of the beast, or like the heights of high finance and now massive philanthropy, one of the most impactful philanthropies in the world. And even you're looking at it being like, this is not enough. Like we need to go much, much bigger if we're going to address these problems in communities, not just in New York, but around the country.
Yeah, but frankly, I'm very humbled by the work that we're doing. I'm really excited about the work that we're involved in right now, and how Robinhood has just continued to push the needle on a lot of really important issues, and not just with our funding, with our voice, with our advocacy, with our partnerships, and all these other respects. But we also have to move with a sense of humility in the idea that you cannot come up with $1 million solutions to $1 trillion problems.
Yes, hallelujah.
So I mean, like we have to be clear about the enemy that we have here, and how big and how broad and how entrenched oftentimes it is. And so, we cannot, and one thing I always, talk about with Robinhood is, when people say, how big is the charity, I say, I don't call what we do charity. I think charity is paternalistic and it's offensive, right? I think, but we're not a charity, we're a change organization. We believe in changing the fundamental structures of the society in which we exist in. And there is no patchwork solutions to being able to address the fact that we have long-term structural breaks in the way we think about everything from housing, to the way we think about transportation, to the way we think about education, to the way we think about justice reform, to the way we think about health, mental and physical health. I mean, all of these aspects play into this idea that we have to just reframe and rethink things when it comes to the policy mechanisms that we are going to support and endorse, and also about how we're thinking about the free usage of capital within our society. Who needs it? Who gets it? When do they get it? And how can we use that as a way of creating true measures and levers of sustainable economic mobility for families?
Yeah, I know Robinhood is all about measurements. When we were in touch the very beginning of the pandemic, we were talking about just trying to get economic relief out to people. And sometimes people asked me like, hey, how did you measure what the 1,000 recipients in the Bronx did with $1,000 each that they received? And I was frank, and I was like, I'm totally confident that the money went to good things. Like, we did not follow the people around. We don't have PhDs studying what they did with $1,000. We were just very, very confident that if you were a struggling family in the Bronx at the beginning of the pandemic, on food stamps or otherwise, like if we give you $1,000, it's going to go to something positive.
I'm telling you, Andrew, it's one of these things, because we are a very data-driven organization. I'm a very data-driven leader. Like, I believe in data deeply. I also know this is that that while we can literally put a quantifiable return ROI on each dollar that's investing to organizations because we literally structured that in the way we think about our investments, when to hear people make this argument of, well, but if we give the money to individuals, what are they going to spend it on? Like, we have to learn that you can be generous and not judgmental.
Yeah.
Right? That we are talking about families who are in some of the deepest, most dire situations. If you took a look at New York alone, in the past, and this is research that we do, we have a partnership with Columbia University to create something called the Poverty Tracker, which is really a longitudinal data set for 4,000 families that we follow, and you can get kind of real-time trend analysis, right? Here's what we found, that half of New Yorkers have suffered the impacts of poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. This was pre-COVID-19. Yeah. Not half of a borough, not half of a demographic group. Half of the city has been in poverty for at least a year over the past 4 years. So we're not talking about a new phenomenon that we're dealing with. We're talking about that half of the city is enduring the pain of poverty on a daily basis. And of the many things that I'm truly, truly proud of, that how this organization has been able to move and mobilize in this moment. I think about the work that we were able to do with the relief fund, and it goes back directly to not just what you were talking about, but in many ways the thesis that you've been arguing for years. Right? Is that, so at the onset of COVID-19, at the onset of the pandemic, we reactivated the Robin Hood Relief Fund, which was to support the highest need New Yorkers who were impacted by COVID-19, and really prioritize the New Yorkers that had been left out of federal aid responses, such as low-income children and families, immigrant communities, college students, low-wage workers, because people forget. Even when you look at the CARES Act, and people say, well, wasn't there a cash assistance element to the CARES Act? Yes, but millions of people were left out of it.
Missed so many people.
I mean, and in a very intentional way, Andrew. It's like, so if people were undocumented, despite them even being workers and taxpayers, they didn't benefit from cash assistance. If you were part of a mixed status family, you didn't benefit from cash assistance. If you were working but not making enough to pay into the tax system, you didn't benefit at all.
That's the one that pains me the most.
That's exactly right.
Even at like the income tax filing threshold. The other one that pains me is students. If you're a young student,
exactly,
you didn't benefit.
You didn't benefit from this. And so we had a federal policy that was put into place, but that intentionally left out in many communities who were oftentimes, the most vulnerable. And yes, we were prioritizing those who were most impacted by the vast racial and health disparities that have been exacerbated by COVID-19. 75% of New York's low wage workers, called to stay on the front lines of the pandemic were people of color, are essential workers. And so when we thought about how can we quickly mobilize cash and assistance, and we think about the fact that even since the pandemic began, since the onset, we've now allocated over $37 million. And just in that time period alone, made over 500 grants to over 430 organizations. So we've been moving fast to get cash in and cash out the door. But one of the things that we were able to do, working with the community and through the community, to identify what some of the greatest needs were. Some of the greatest needs were basic cash assistance.
Yes.
Basic cash assistance, where 46% of our grants that we made in that through our relief fund were to provide emergency cash assistance for low-income New Yorkers to cover necessities. And we weren't asking them to fill out theses to explain what were your necessities.
What are you going to do with it? Yeah.
What are you going to do with it? We need to see receipts. No. What we're saying is, here's support, Godspeed. And we want to make sure that this does not have to become something that just becomes a repetitive process that these families and these communities are then forced to endure. And so how to rethink this whole process, how we're thinking, philanthropy's role in this became a really important and speedy exercise that not just us, but also, we watched a lot of other organizations take real leadership in it. And it was really great to see.
I'd say the number one concern that most of us have during this pandemic is just trying to stay positive and healthy throughout. A lot of the days blend in with each other. And one way you can take better care of yourself and make sure you're eating right is to join Freshly. They send you food that's pre-prepared. It's delicious. It's easy. If you don't know how to cook, it's perfect. Just order Freshly and they send you the food. You eat it and you feel better about yourself because it wasn't crap. That's really like you could maybe Freshly should rebrand itself not crap.
Not crapply.
Because I have to say, for whatever reason, it's so easy to eat crap right now. I don't know about the rest of you. It's like you go to that kitchen and whatever's there is just like, oh, sure. Like you just want to freaking shovel it into your mouth. So instead you can shovel fresh cooked healthy food into your mouth with Freshly. It makes you feel a lot better. You wake up the next day feeling great. And Freshly.com is offering our listeners $40 off for their first 2 orders at Freshly.com/Yang. That's Freshly.com/Yang. Look, invest in yourself, invest in your health. This is a no-brainer for folks who aren't exactly tearing it up in the kitchen or on the treadmill right now, which I suspect is most all of us.
So, Andrew, my apartment building has not had gas for like a year. And I'm in a war with the management company because you can't cook. And so Freshly has been a godsend because I don't have any other options that's remotely healthy. So if you're my management company and you're listening to this, screw you. And for those of you who are not, the vast majority who are not related to my management company, check out Freshly because not being physically able to cook has led me to Freshly.com. So Freshly.com/Yang, check it out.
Well, you're in a similar boat to the boat I've been in, which is you're doing tremendous work that you believe in, and it's very, I mean, in your case, it's extraordinary, like, top of the line. And then you also see, like, hey, I'm not actually solving the problem. That even if I have 37 million I give to these orgs, it's like, I should probably have another couple zeros, and even then, and for anyone listening to this, they're like, holy cow, like, this org has a size and scale and heft that most orgs can only dream of. It's one reason why I think your book is so timely, and you obviously were working on it before everything that happened with George Floyd and nationwide. But it's called 5 days, and it's about the 5 days at the center of the Freddie Gray protests in Baltimore that racked the city. We all remember the images. We all remember the CVS and like the other indelible images we have from the Freddie Gray protests. So tell me about, obviously you're in Baltimore right now, you're from Baltimore, and so the city's near and dear to your heart. How did you experience those protests in real time? And then how did this book come about?
Yeah, it's wild because I think about this book was actually set to be released, I believe it was on April 14th. It was supposed to be released on the anniversary of everything that happened in the uprising in Baltimore around Freddie Gray's death. And it was probably around the beginning of March when I called my publisher and said, we can't release it then. And I told him because, that's when we're right in the heat of everything going on with COVID. I was like, I'm trying to run a very big organization right now, and the whole world is shifting under our feet, and I've got to stay focused. And so they're like, no, we get it. And they said, all right, what about, and they just picked a random date. They were like, what about, June 23rd? And I said, that sounds good. I mean, at that point I was like, as long as it's not now, yeah, I'm good, right? I got to stay focused on this. And it just so happened that June 20th, a couple weeks after we made the final decision to push the date back, is when we first learned the names Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And there's actually a horror to the timeliness of it in the way that a date that they picked that was relatively arbitrary is so timely. And there's a horror to that when we think about when would there have not been a timely moment to have this conversation about inequity in our society and racial inequity. And, you know, I remember the whole thing kind of began when I was sitting in Freddie Gray's funeral. And for those who might not remember, you know, Freddie Gray was a 25-year-old young man in Baltimore who made eye contact with police and ran. The reason I say that is because that was his crime. Was if you are in a high crime, oftentimes high poverty area, making eye contact with police and running is enough to trigger probable cause. Had he done that in a wealthy neighborhood, he would have been going for a jog. But he makes eye contact with police and runs in Harlem Park, Sandtown, Winchester, which are two areas of Baltimore, West Baltimore, deep poverty. And he's arrested. An hour after he's arrested, he's in a coma. And when he's finally taken to the University of Maryland Medical Center, it is deemed that he has 3 broken vertebrae and a crushed voice box and a crushed larynx. And so there were protests that took place in Baltimore for 2 weeks after, demanding justice and accountability, saying, you know, how is someone arrested and an hour later they're in a coma? And no one has an answer for what happened. And the morning of his funeral, I went to the funeral, and Andrew was crazy because I remember sitting in the back of the church, and I didn't feel like I had earned the right to make that walk up to go view the body. So I just sat in the back. And I left the funeral, and I had to fly to Boston to give a talk on poverty. And the irony of that hit me really hard. That the night of his funeral was the night that Baltimore started this process, and that's when you saw the unrest take place, literally to the point that by 6 o'clock that night, the governor had called in the National Guard and put Baltimore under a state of emergency and a curfew. And I found myself in Boston talking about poverty, both because of the work that I was doing, because at that point I was running an organization that I founded that focused on helping students, generally first generation students, make it and stay in college. But I also knew that they were there to kind of talk about my past and my background and put me up as an example. And it was in that moment that I started realizing how dangerous that was, how it made me complicit as well.
Wow.
That we can't sit there and say and look at the people who make it and say it's because of them and it's such a great story. And then look at ones who don't and say it's because of them and it's because they didn't work hard, without understanding the systems that we still have in place.
Well, that's what your book, The Other Wes Moore, is all about.
That's exactly right. Right? It's about
the same neighborhood, and one winds up here, and then the other winds up, in jail.
That's right. And how we are so quick as a society to either congratulate or to castigate without being willing to understand or indict systems that we have in all of this. And I think about this in context. And, earlier on this week, we had the current governor of Maryland, he announced that he's putting out a book, right? And in the book, he starts talking a lot about this moment, and he was the brand new governor. I think he was governor for 3 months at the time when everything jumped off with Freddie Gray. But during this book, he spends time, and the exact quote that he used when he was describing Freddie Gray was, he called him a Crips gang-connected, street-level drug dealer with a long criminal rap sheet. I spent 4 years focusing on and understanding what happened around Freddie Gray and what happened in Baltimore around those times. And here's what I do know. And I can say this definitively, that the story of Freddie Gray's life is a story of societal failure. Because this was a young man who was born underweight and premature. He was also born addicted to heroin because his mother battled heroin addiction for much of her life. She grew up in deep poverty her entire life. She gives birth to twins. Once the twins are old enough that they actually gain enough weight that they're able to leave the hospital, they move into a housing project on North Carey Street over in West Baltimore. And that housing project in 2009, along with 480 other homes, were actually cited in a civil lawsuit because of the endemic levels of lead inside of that house. And Andrew, it's like, the CDC, right? The Center for Disease Control indicates that if a person has 6 milliliters of lead in every deciliter of blood, that person will have cognitive damages for the remainder of their life, right? We've known this as a neurotoxin for a century. you have a person of 6. Freddie Gray had 36. So this was a young man who was born premature, underweight, addicted to heroin, and lead poisoned. And by that time in his life, he's 2. And so when we're making these judgments about people, by the time he was in 5th grade, he was 4 grade levels behind in reading because of the cognitive damage of the lead poisoning. You know, he finished his last recorded day of school in the Baltimore City school system was in 10th grade, and he was 19 years old. He had been in special education classes his entire academic career because of the lead poisoning. And so when I'm hearing this, where you know, hearing the current governor making points about how, well, you know, he was no choir boy. He was no singer in the church choir. I know he wasn't. But I also know this, is that Freddie Gray never had a shot. Freddie Gray never had a chance. And that was the point of all of this, is that we have to understand all of these moments and all these periods. We have got to understand it with a sense of context, because the truth is that every system that touched Freddie's life, whether it was the health system or the housing system or the education system or our policing system, that it not only failed to help him, but it did severe and lasting damage. And now we see the product of that.
Yeah, and he dies in police custody after an hour. I mean, like that's like the brutal end, you know, to a story of institutional failure.
That's
you know,
exactly right.
And the tough part of it is that, like, if you have a set of systems or an economy that's grinding people up, and then someone dies as a result, it's almost like a reflex to say, well, what was wrong with this person? You know, yes. Because that's actually a more comforting stance and narrative than to say, like, wait a minute, like, maybe we've had problems up and down for years and decades and generations, or even the fact that in his case, I mean, you know, he's born to a mother who's addicted to heroin. I mean, you could probably trace some problems even before he's born. Yeah. To various failures. And this is something, so the book, one of the things in the book that struck me was there's a woman, I believe her name is Tawanda Jones.
Yeah.
And she's protesting, like, I believe it was her brother or like someone else who was a victim of police violence. And so she's holding like weekly protests before Freddie dies. And then the Freddie Gray protests end up getting built into like a pre-existing. And this struck me forcibly because you're like, wow, there's like a constant sort of waterfall of impacted families and protests that pre-exist any one person, where everyone's looking around being like, who are you protesting? Because they had like different family members who'd been victimized. So that was one thing where I was like, wow, like if you're in that environment, like that is mind-blowing for most.
I'm telling you, Andrew, one of the most fascinating things for me about the project of writing 5 days was first identifying who were the people that I wanted to follow over this 5-day period, and that I wanted the reader to be able to walk through this era, walk through this chaos through their eyes, through the eyes of these people. And one of the first people I knew that I was like, I've got to make sure she's profiled is Tawanda Jones. And because it's important to remember that even in the 2 years before Freddie Gray, right, there was Chris Brown, there was Anthony Anderson, and there was her brother, Tyrone West. And every Wednesday, still to this day, in fact, she just had the 371st straight West Wednesday, where every Wednesday she protests. Sometimes it's just her and maybe one other person, and sometimes she's got hundreds of people with her. But rain, sleet, snow, doesn't matter. She protests. And she protests the fact that even prior to all this, where she was in, and she found herself and I was having these amazing conversations with her where she would say, you know, I was so proud to march with the Gray family when they called me and asked me. And I was so proud of the fact that the city was standing up and saying, you know, yes, we want justice, and yes, we have to address policing. But she said, but I just also felt a certain type of way where I still thought to myself, but where was this when my brother was killed? Right? Where was this when my brother's body was literally left in the middle of the street with mace all over him and boot prints all over his body? Where was this? And so every Wednesday, she protests, demanding justice and accountability for what happened to her brother. And she was such a fascinating person to follow over that 5-day period, especially when you look at it in context of who some of the other people were, right? So you had Tawanda, but then I also, spent time following Major Mark Partee, who was a Baltimore City police major who grew up in West Baltimore. And I remember him specifically telling me before where he said, listen, I know that none of my colleagues woke up that morning with homicide in their mind. But I also know that for kids in West Baltimore, where I grew up, I know why they don't believe me. Right? Or following someone like Greg Butler, who's a basketball star turned protester, or following someone like John Angelos, who's the son of the owner of the Baltimore Orioles, literally, a billionaire, who was also the head of baseball operations for the Orioles. And on the Wednesday after, baseball played its first ever game with no fans. Now we're doing it all the time. But their first ever game with no fans when the Orioles played the Chicago White Sox. And it was because John Angelos was one of the people in the room making the final decision of basically saying, no, we should play the game even though the city is in a state of emergency because the world needs to see this. And so watching the various and different perspectives of people like that, people like a Nick Mosby, who's a city councilman at the time, whose wife was the state's attorney in Baltimore, but watching it through their eyes, I think, hopefully provided a real kaleidoscope understanding of the complexity of the moment, but also that if we thought that this was just about policing or just about Freddie, that we were missing a bigger point, that society was trying to tell us something else, that they were hoping that we would actually pay attention to.
Well, there was another fact in the Tawanda Jones narrative that also hit me really hard, which was that, and I'm not sure if it was for her brother or for another victim, but they essentially settled for $1 million and gave it to the 3 survivors of the victim of police brutality. And that struck me because it was a situation where it's like, well, you clearly know that something went terribly wrong if you were settling with a family, but there's no no arrests made, no accountability. It's just like there's a death and then there's like some money. Yeah. And one of the things that I found when I was researching the extent of the problem of police misconduct was that actually happens all over the country, where they're settling these civil judgments to the tune of over $1 billion a year in the aggregate. And so that's their way of papering over this problem. And so if you think about like the number of times it happens and no one gets a dime, or the number of times it happens and someone sues and it's completely unsuccessful because can you imagine trying to sue your local police department? I mean, that sounds like very, very difficult to me, you feel like everything would be uphill. So the fact that you're still getting $1 billion under those conditions struck me as a sign that the problem is orders of magnitude bigger. Like if you had to try and throw a measurement on it, you were like, police are causing billions of dollars of bodily harm to Americans every single year. And the fact that was happening in Baltimore, where there's like no real responsibility, but here's some like blood money. Essentially, it's like, hey, we killed your dad, but here's a little bit of money. Like maybe that makes up for it. Like that also hit me really hard.
And honestly, and I think Tawanda's story is such a powerful one around it because she didn't take any money, and it was for that reason. Because they also knew that with taking the payment meant there was also essentially
an agreement to never talk about this again.
Right? And she's like, I'm not going to stop talking about it. So she never took any money for it.
Wow.
But and you bring up an incredibly important point, because there is this narrative about Baltimore when people say, so what brought the temperature down? What calmed everything down in Baltimore? And oftentimes the narrative is, well, it was when the National Guard were called in, right? That's not true. Because, first of all, I can tell you as a person who, very proudly wore the uniform, oftentimes when you introduce military personnel into situations, that doesn't calm situations down, right? But the second thing and the most important thing to remember is some of the biggest protests that were going to take place in Baltimore were actually set to take place the Saturday after the unrest. What happened, why those protests never happened, wasn't because the National Guard was there. The National Guard was already there when they were being planned. What happened was was when the state's attorney, Marilyn Mosby, announced she was pressing charges against the 6 officers. Because up until that point, you're absolutely right, Andrew. It's like the thread was common, right? Something happened, a payout ensued, and it went away. That was the general trend, right? But this was the first time in Baltimore history where the state's attorney was actually saying, no, I'm actually pressing charges against these officers for misconduct. I remember being there, Andrew, where there was almost this celebratory vibe throughout the streets of Baltimore because people were shocked. People were like, wait, she announced what? That they're arresting the officers for that? Because we had never seen that before. And now, granted, fast forward, we had 2 of the officers were found not guilty. 4 of the officers their charges were dismissed. But that moment, that was what brought the temperature down, because people thought for the first time we actually might see justice. And what's interesting now, I think, even when you look at what's happened with George Floyd, one of the big differences I think between then and now is the bar has been risen, where at that point the charges were like, whoa, that's a big deal, calm everything down. Now charges have been filed. The bar isn't about charges anymore. The bar is convictions. And that's going to be the real test to see, can you actually get convictions for these instances? In the case of George Floyd, when you are literally watching a grown man in handcuffs on the ground with another man nonchalantly leaning his knee into his neck until he can no longer breathe. I mean, the bar is not, can we get an arrest? The bar is conviction for that.
Yeah, you can see why the standards are high on both sides, or at least, and you've dug into this the same way I have, where if you're a local attorney or state's attorney or an attorney general, the last thing you generally want to do is pick a fight with your law enforcement department, because you literally work with them hand in hand all the time.
Absolutely.
And even if it's like the state level, you still know the same people. The universe is very, very small. So there's like every incentive for that person not to bring charges is number one. And then number 2, the legal standard around convicting a police officer is almost ridiculously high. In a lot of places, the police officer is like, well, I felt threatened, or the person's like making
that's enough.
Making a move, and then that's enough. It's like you have to get inside their brain and being like, well, and like it's very hard to prove that, and not, and so if you're a jury, you look up and say, what's the standard I'm working with, and then you say, well, I guess this person's not guilty. So the conviction standard is going to be very, very different than the bring the suit standard. And the bring the suit standard itself was very, very high. And it was high enough where in Baltimore's case, everyone was so shocked that they, felt like their mission had been at least somewhat achieved. Yeah. It sounds like.
That's right. And particularly because there was no precedent to that before. So the fact that bar, the fact that glass ceiling had been shattered was pretty remarkable that it happened. But this actually really is an important point too. When people are saying, well, we have to make sure we are supporting our law enforcement, et cetera. I agree. And trust me, as someone who has had the experience of knowing what it's like to put on a uniform and walk into areas and communities that you're not familiar with, I understand how complicated the job is. We do need to support them. And at the same time, what we also have to do is come up with policies and rules and structures that can support the ones who are doing the good work, and be able to make sure we don't have to have these incidents continue to happen within our societies. I think about it in context of even, the debate that's taking place right now about defund the police or abolish the police, et cetera. And I make it very clear, I am not for abolishing the police. I am for abolishing police brutality. I'm for abolishing race-based policing. I am for abolishing the hyper-militarization of policing that we have within our society right now. I'm absolutely for abolishing that. But I also know that how we are thinking about the safety and security for our communities, that can't happen just with some blind or blanket statement of support law enforcement. We have to be clear about what that means.
Yes.
And one of the most effective ways you can actually support them is by making sure that we are tasking them to do the tasks that they should be doing. And also that we are holding those accountable who should be held accountable. It's impossible for me to have a good apple, bad apple conversation when this isn't about good apples, bad apples. It's about systems. And we have to really rethink systems in all this if we're going to plan on being effective.
Well, one of the things I can say looking at it is that all of the incentives in the system steer a particular direction. You
Yes.
know what I mean? And it's one reason why people grow so frustrated and angry because they see that the system's working for certain people, generally those who are within the system or custodians of the system, and not members of the public that in theory
Right.
the system's supposed to be looking out for or serving. I'm not sure if this was the intention, but I felt like with a book being written with these different perspectives and characters, it almost felt like it could be a docuseries or a movie. I'm not sure. I mean, you obviously have a lot of experience with that medium as well.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that was part of the thinking.
You know, it's funny. It was not part of the thinking. I've been really humbled by the response to the book. People are getting it and they're picking it up, and that's been really exciting. And also, we have now seen where people are saying, is there another way to tell the story too by using other
Sure.
mediums to be able to tell the story as well, television or film, et cetera. And I, but the thing I think that is I really liked about it was it shows how quickly these things can turn. And it shows how quickly the arc of not just a societal arc, but the individual arc can move in these moments. If you talk to most people on Saturday and you said to them, I just want to let you know that in 5 days, the city's going to be under a state of emergency. There are going to be National Guardsmen in military uniforms patrolling our streets. We will have had tens of millions of dollars of damage already that we would have seen. We would have played baseball games with no one inside the stadium. And we would have played baseball games with with fans being forced to stay in the stadium. All these things would have happened, and you would have watched. And then, not to mention on the individual level. And I don't want to spoil it, but for people who pick it up, when you watch where, for example, Major Partee started at the beginning of the book and where he ended in terms of his career prospects, when you look at the life prospects of where Greg Butler started and where he ended, if you look at just the arc of these individuals during this time period, it's a staggering shift. And that's the point is, where what I think and I hope people understand is we watched a major American city implode in 5 days. This doesn't take long. And the thing about it is that we are pre-baking an incredibly powerful explosive, and we're giving it a very short wick. And when these incidents happen, all they are sparks.
Yep.
And they are sparks. And when that wick gets caught, it's a very short period of time before it wears down, and then we have the explosive. And that's, I think, in many ways what we saw in Baltimore 5 years ago.
If you're a parent right now, you are concerned about a lot of things where your kids learning, education, health, environment. And one thing you can do that will make an immediate difference is join Literati. It's the leading kids book club in America. It sends you and your child 5 new and unique kids books every month. You don't have to do anything. You set and forget it. And then these books arrive, and then you open it. Your child is pumped about bedtime and story time. This was made for parents like you. If you're busy, you're tied up, and you want a subscription book club that makes it easy just to find unique and interesting books for your kids straight to your doorstep. I'm a big fan. Who would not be a big fan of freaking kids' creative books getting sent to your home? If you are a parent and you love your child, you should join Literati. If you don't, I don't know what it says about you as a parent.
You have to if you love your child.
If you don't have a child, join too. Then send it to someone with a child. No, that's probably overboard. But for a limited time,
I don't have kids. Yeah. That's not for me. But my friends.
you're like, I swear by Literati.
Fully endorse.
It does make a great gift.
Yeah, it's a good gift.
If you have friends with kids and you don't have kids. So for a limited time, go to literati.com/yang for 25% off your first 2 orders. That's the best offer available anywhere. To get it, you have to go to literati.com/yang for 25% off your first 2 orders. How do you spell Literati? If you don't know, you're not literati, but it's spelled like it sounds. Literati.com/yang. How concerned are you about our societal integrity right now, because I'm very concerned. You know, like the trends that you have been fighting for years were in place before COVID. Now COVID has decimated opportunities in many communities. They don't have a cushion they can fall back on. To the extent that they were eligible for relief money, it ran out weeks ago. And I'm the numbers guy. 42% of these jobs are not returning. And we have to start facing facts. There's like this completely nonsensical, like, oh, maybe we'll just snap back to normal. And then I ask people, it's like, are you going to be running out to the bar, concert hall, sporting event, like anytime, like
That's right.
you like making a dash for, the bus, it's like, so it's like you times, 100 million, like no one's going to be doing this. Google has a hiring freeze. Like where the heck is someone, and they're still printing money. So if you like take the average small business, it's not like they're going to be looking to hire folks who just got laid off from the bar, the nail salon, like the what have you. So I'm terrified as to what that can become very quickly. Like I think that there's going to be disintegration, like on a personal level, disintegration like a family level, disintegration on the level of these communities, and that can result in violence, like combustion. Your description of certain communities as being built up of flammable material with very short wicks, I agree. And how concerned are you about the fact that we may be witnessing some terrible scenes in the United States over the next coming weeks and months?
Yeah, I'm very concerned. To be very honest, I'm very concerned because I feel like much of the frustration, it isn't new, and it's justified, right? I mean, you bring up some really important points, Andrew. It's, prior to COVID-19, we weren't good, right?
We were sick already.
We weren't just walking around like everything's gravy, and then COVID hit and things got crazy. If you look at the people who lost their jobs since COVID-19, 23% of people who lost their jobs due to COVID-19 were living in poverty before COVID-19, right? This was the working poor. People who were working jobs, in many cases, multiple jobs, and still were living below the poverty line. That was pre-COVID-19 that we had that reality. Pre-COVID-19, we had the reality where 40% of people could not afford a $400 shock with cash, right? Pre-COVID-19. Now we've seen that shock, and it is real, and it is much more than $400. And so I'm genuinely concerned, but I'm specifically genuinely concerned if we don't act.
Yes.
And what I mean by act is not just like, while and I say this with a tremendous amount of appreciation and humility. I have watched how people have been so generous during this moment, and being able to give to organizations and give to foundations and give to social service networks and do all that kind of stuff in the most beautiful of ways. And I'm so thankful for that. And I always will be. I also know this is that we have the type of headwinds that there is not going to be enough philanthropy that's going to be able to address it.
Yes.
I think about in the country right now, there is around $700 billion every year that goes towards philanthropy. And people say like, wow, that's a really big number. I didn't realize the number was so big. That is true. Now, here's the reality. Half of that goes to colleges and universities, alma maters, right? So it's not 700 billion. Now we are looking at 350 billion. Okay. Now people can say, well, that's still a pretty big number. Fair. That is a big number. Half of that goes to homes of worship and hospitals. So now we're down to 175 billion for everything else. For housing, for children, for education, for seniors, for the environment, for veterans, for poverty. These problems are much bigger than that. And so federal policies and state and local protections, including things like expanded unemployment and benefits, stimulus payments, SNAP benefits increases, eviction moratoriums, these are all things that have helped people survive the past 4 months. Survive the past 4 months. And we have now the prospect of tens of millions of people that will fall deeper into poverty without continued aid supports and expansions, that include immigrant communities who oftentimes have been left out of the first tranche of all this. And so I'm especially and particularly nervous about this next phase and where we are, particularly if we cannot get serious about coming up with ways to be able to support in a really fully functional way that's able to address the problem that we actually have in hand.
I want to smash my head against a wall, pull my hair out, gnash my teeth over the fact that our government is not seeing the obvious. The fact that we need to go much bigger in terms of emergency cash relief for people. I would expand it beyond the IRS mechanism. I did not hate the fact that they use the IRS as a way to get cash out to people, but it missed a lot of folks. And my organization, we just were like, what's your Venmo? What's your Cash App? What's your PayPal? Let's just get you money in a way that you actually can get it quick. And there's no reason our government cannot do the same thing. If it was we should just be shoveling resources out to people as quickly as possible. And there are some boneheads in Congress who are just looking at it the exact wrong way, where they're like, oh, people aren't working, or oh, the deficit. It's like, are you kidding me? Both of those are so inflation. I mean, we're in the probably in the process of entering a deflationary cycle because no one wants to spend or take risks. So we should be putting money into people's hands as quickly as possible and effectively. And if we don't do it, I think we're going to witness the disintegration of many, many families, communities, lives, and it's going to be devastating, catastrophic.
Yeah. And this actually gives us an interesting opportunity, Andrew, to actually rethink a lot of things and a lot of systems that should have been rethought prior to COVID-19, right? So we absolutely need to do things like, continue the federal unemployment insurance benefits. We absolutely need to do things like, increase maximum SNAP benefits and extend the pandemic EBT programs, improving child tax credits by making them fully refundable, those type of things. We know those things have to be in place, but there's also some other bigger things that we think about as well. Consider the fact that over the past 4 months, we've now watched 5.6 million people lose their health insurance. And oftentimes that's because we had a health insurance system that is based on employer insurance. So when we lose 11 years of job growth in 11 weeks, it didn't make sense before. But we're watching the impacts and the implications of now watching over 5 million people who are now uninsured because their jobs went away. And how do we decouple these things? How are we having conversation around education? I am terribly concerned about what's going to happen in the fall.
Yes. I just had conversations with Emily Oster. I don't know if you know.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. About how school districts are preparing or not preparing, really.
That's right.
And the thought is that many schools are going to feel like discretion is the better part of valor. And as soon as someone gets sick or even beforehand, they were like, well, let's send everyone home, which has its own set of devastating effects on various families. It seems like quote unquote, the responsible thing to do, but it actually is abdicating responsibility for a lot of kids and families.
And not to mention the fact that, in addition to the fact that we're watching this seismic educational gap that is about to blow open if we're not being incredibly deliberate about it. But, we forget that our schools are the largest food provider for children in the country. Our schools are the largest mental health provider for children in the country. Our schools are the largest child care provider for families in this country. So it's not just what are the kids learning, reading, writing, arithmetic. It's all content. The other things that schools provide to families. And so this gives us an interesting opportunity to actually take some things that we swallowed as truth, we swallowed as fact, and allows us to say, is there a way to actually reevaluate, right? Is there a way to actually think differently and say, should we be having conversations about school years and school days? Should we be having conversations about the ways we are compensating our teachers? And when you consider the heroic work that they are doing, should we be having conversations about completely rethinking the educational structure? How many days and years and weeks we have students who are inside a formalized classroom? How do we have a conversation on making all these assets like tablets and computers completely universal rights for kids?
Man, I mean, I agree with you that we need to reinvent and rethink many of these things given the nature of the crisis we're in. I just throw my hands up as to whether that investment and reimagining is happening. Like we just seem stuck. And then when we're not able to deliver on what we used to do, then we're like, well, I guess we're not going to do a whole heck of a lot of anything, particularly for people who are toward the bottom of the resource level. I mean, what Emily was saying to me was that some rich families are just getting some like old school medieval style tutor who comes and like lives with a kid, and like it goes back to like the, some kind of strange Game of Thrones type arrangement where you have like, like that's what's going on with like families at the top. I hope that we do reinvent these systems. We need to rewrite the rules of the economy, in my mind. And you're 100% right that philanthropy doesn't have the right scale. You're looking at it. I mean, we're like a $22 trillion economy pre-crisis. You kneecap us, like you knock one leg out. I mean, like you need trillions of dollars to try and shore up where that leg used to be. And the scale of philanthropy, even if we're all to get channeled towards it. And I'm like you, it's like I appreciate everyone who's actually stepping up. I mean, it's great. But given the size of the whole, you need our government to get its shit together, and our government does not seem to have its shit together.
Yeah. But I do think, though, that that's actually a unique place also where philanthropy can play. Because
shaming
I think
government, that's right.
Well, no, because I think philanthropy needs to appreciate the fact that we're not just check writers. Right? I believe deeply that the most powerful tool that I have at my disposal is not the purse, it's our voice. It's the fact that when you think about these philanthropic organizations and these social service organizations, that it's not just the fact that we can influence and we can use we can create catalytic capital. Right? We can be venture philanthropists. We can invest early. We can de-risk things. And there is an important component to that within our large society.
You should fund a UBI trial with me, brother. Let's fund some UBI in the Bronx. Let's de-risk that, and then the government will come in and be like, "Hey, look at that."
That is the unique role of philanthropy, and I agree. And so I think about that. I think about the role of how we've even thought about it within our relief fund. Right, where part of the reason that I'm so excited that we were able to generate and working a lot on your leadership and your vision around this. Right, is how do we go and support organizations that were right now doing it with direct cash assistance? So I think about the fact that we were able to work with Give Directly for SNAP users with low balances, work with CUNY for thousands of low-income CUNY students, work with the Chinese American Planning Council for low-income Chinese immigrants, work with with NYC Kids Rise for families who are hit the hardest in communities like Queens, New York, the most diverse community in the entire country. And so we were able to do that and use philanthropic dollars for those type of things in a way that we really can prove that things are working and working to de-risk it. I also, though, believe, to your point, part of the most powerful thing that we can do is once we can invest in something, the things that we've invested in that I'm most proud of are the things we no longer invest in.
Yes. Yeah.
Right? The things we don't have to invest in anymore. It's either the problem was solved or government took it over. Because the government now knew that, listen, this works. One of the proudest, one of the things that Robin had often talked about, kind of as one of his proudest moments, was we were the first organization that invested in needle exchanges. And we did it at a time when it was really controversial and really scary, and people saying, what do you mean, giving drug dealers clean needles? Well, the data was showing that if you're looking at the rise of HIV AIDS, it was actually the transmission of dirty needles. That was one of the fastest rates for this transmission. And so we piloted it and we funded it. And now we don't fund it anymore. No one does, because the federal government does it. But they were never going to be first money in. And so this becomes a unique opportunity to be able to work with not just the federal government, but state governments, city governments, to be able to say, let us test things out. Let us be the risk capital.
Let's do it, man. Where do you want to pilot UBI in New York? Anywhere Robinhood operates. We're 100% going to do this. That's going to be the fruit of this conversation. My biggest question for you, Wes, is a personal one. I've known you for years. And your biography is remarkable. It's the stuff of, frankly, almost too good to be true, made for TV movie type stuff, like jumping out of planes, defending the country, trying to fight poverty at the scale you're fighting it. I've been in rooms with you. I've been in similar rooms. And there were times when I felt like, and this would be more extreme for you than it would be for me. Because, like, and when I was running for president, I actually kind of realized a little bit of like the role I was filling, like the persona. Like in your case, you're like the walking inspirational, like, hey, like I'm like the embodiment of the American dream. Like as a leader who's come out of really difficult circumstances and now is someone that everyone looks to for inspiration. The personal question is, like, when I was in those rooms, there were times when I just felt like screaming my head off. Like where like I have that role, and like, as particularly when I was the head of a nonprofit, because you're continuously, there was like this, dynamic you had where it's like, and now here's inspirational nonprofit leader, and then I'm like, okay, like I will now play my role to the best of my ability, and then you will give me this grant, maybe if I'm lucky or I did a good job, and then whatever size the grant is, then like I act like it's the greatest thing in the world, like even if maybe like I was hoping for something a little different or bigger, and so there were times like when I really struggled personally. Now I've known you for years, and I've never really felt from you like anything but like 100% like functional sincerity, really. Like you always seem to be inhabiting yourself and very present. So I'm just wondering whether or how you deal with like any of those thoughts or pressures, if you have them, or if I'm just projecting my own struggles onto you.
Brother, it is an everyday thing, but I realize too, it's an everyday thing for all of us, right? And actually, and I give you a lot of praise in the fact that you own it. I think there's a lot of people who walk around like it's not real, like it's not this. I mean, transparency and humility are incredibly powerful, particularly to see in people that I admire, like you, because the reality is that pressure is real. And I think that part of the thing that I think that kind of keeps me in a level of center, and I know it does for you as well, is we do walk around knowing that our narratives, our stories, when you consider our backgrounds and our journeys, are unlikely. That we weren't the people who came from, this was not a quote unquote societal birthright. This was something that there were people in our lives, family members, friends, mentors, coaches, etc., who in many ways saw something in us before we could even see it in ourselves. And I think about it in the case of like my grandfather, where my grandfather was actually the first one on my mom's side of the family born in this country. He was born in Charleston, South Carolina, but he wasn't raised here. And the reason was because when he was just a toddler, the Ku Klux Klan ran him and the rest of my family out of this country. Not just out of Charleston, South Carolina, because my great-grandfather was a minister, and he's a very vocal minister. And eventually the verbal threats became physical ones, and he picked up his family in the middle of the night and he left this country. And the majority of my family, they vowed to never come back here, and they didn't. My grandfather did. My grandfather was the only one who came back to the United States and started his family here with my great-grandmother, who's actually from Cuba, and they came to the South Bronx, where he was a minister, the first black minister in the history of the Dutch Reformed Church. My grandmother was a school teacher in the South Bronx for almost 30 years. And I think about it in context of this, where this was a man who was forced out of this country when he was just a child. Some of his earliest memories were America's ugliest moments. And he loved this country like no one I knew. And I think about, and part of the reason I have to tell you, Andrew, why when you told me that, my first gut reaction was that you're running, my first gut reaction was to hug you, because what else are we supposed to be doing? Like, this country is an extraordinarily special experiment. And it's something that every drop of progress has been hard-earned. It has not been inevitable. And it's something that needed to happen because the words of this country were not matching up to its practices. Its ideals and its values were not matching up to its practices. And so every single bit of progress that we have made in this country has been hard earned and it's been hard fought for. And what choice do we have, particularly considering the past and the legacies that we come from, but to fight, but to stand up and be a portion as brave as my grandfather was, as your family was. Have a portion of the bravery and the courage and the loyalty and the patriotism that they had. And so this is hard stuff, man. And sometimes there is a level, the place that we call home will leave us with a level of frustration that is sometimes indescribable. Our job isn't to stay there, though. Our job is to remember not just why we're here, but the progress we have made, and to know that if that progress is going to continue, it's on us. We're not responsible for where things are right now, but the truth is, if they're like that 20 years from now, that is our cross to bear. That is on us. And that's what I just take seriously.
Well, you certainly embody that through your action, your career, the stories that you've been amplifying and sharing with the world. It's a privilege to be your friend, Wes, and it's going to be a privilege to abolish poverty alongside you in the days to come. First in a small part of the country, and then hopefully society-wide. So thank you for this. Your new book, 5 Days, it's awesome. All of your books have been spectacular. And yeah, I'm so glad we got to sit down. I've been looking forward to this as well. I got lost on the trail for quite some time, but spending time with you now in this way, it feels a little bit like a homecoming. I feel a little bit like I've gone full circle.
Me too, brother. I'm proud of you, man. Keep pushing, keep prodding. We will be better, and we'll do it together. I appreciate you.
Appreciate you, man. All the best to the family.
You too, man.
Thank you for listening in. I hope you enjoyed this conversation. If you did, please do subscribe to Yang Speaks and click on notifications so we can let you know every time we have a new episode.